Hello there, sword fans. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. This is a Cloudhammer Steelworks $400 SUP 12 katana on loan to me from RVA Katana. And so, first off, RVA Katana has sent me a number of review samples to check out. This is the last in a list of them that I need to get through, and I've taken my good, sweet time to get through all of them, this being the last one of the batch that was sent to me. So special thanks to John at RVA Katana for his patience and generosity in sending me these things to check out and share with you, and especially double down on the patience part. Anyway, this is a sword supposedly made of SUP 12. It's not a steel that I'm familiar with, and I have no way of validating if it is or isn't made of that, but supposedly it's supposed to be good steel. My intention for this video is I'm going to move this one around. This is going to go back to John at RVA Katana, and I believe it is his dojo sword, or he has some other intentions for it. So I'm not going to be pushing it to failure, but I can elaborate on some of the experiences that I've had in using it. And I have used it for some aggressive stuff, so I've trained with it over the course of the better part of a year now. On and off, I've used it kind of in the rotation of swords that I bring in and out of the reviews. And then I've also done some cutting bottles, light things, up to some larger cardboard tubes and the like. And so I can talk about the experiences of using it for Yaido and also using it to cut targets with. Anyway, this is around a $400 sword, and so it's worth noting that before I go too far into it. And then also, I guess, some disclaimers. I'm not an expert in this stuff, and do know this is on loan to me. I didn't spend any money on it, and if you think that makes me bias you, you know, quasi close to the start, I suppose. Anyway, I'm going to go over soup to nuts, top to bottom, the bits and bobs and features, if you will, and then I'll wrap up with my closing thoughts. Hopefully it's interesting. So the kashira, the end cap, the little pommel bit right here. First, if I pull on it, I can wiggle it around a little bit, and it was always like this. It's tight on there. It hasn't moved. It hasn't come off. I've used this, not necessarily extensively, but a reasonable amount, and the kashira hasn't really come off in a way that I would say is concerning, but it does have a little bit of wiggle there. Sometimes some adhesive is used here. I don't know if traditionally adhesive was used or not, but the fact that I can pull it and wiggle it means that I'm just a little bit on the fence on how long it's going to last with extended use. And if the intention is to use this as kind of a dojo guest blade where somebody might be using it in every class, you might want to find a little syringe or something and stick some Gorilla Glue under there. Anyway, as it is, the transitions on this are actually really good. So tip of my hat to Cloudhammer Steelworks. This has been a thing that I've complained about on a number of swords. Maybe it's a happy accident, maybe not, but I do like the way this transitions. There's not anything jarring or problematic about it. The theme on the fittings as well, not something I want to harp on a whole lot. They're just not to my aesthetic style personally. There's some gold and silver detailing on the Fuchi kashira, as well as on the Tsuba, and those I really struggle to like that kind of gold and silver detailing. Often it comes off as finger painty and just kind of a pale imitation of what it's trying to replicate. Now in this case, it's okay. It's not as good as some other casting folks out there, but it's also not the worst. I can make out subtle details, like this is a tree branch. I can make out little lines indicating that it's supposed to be wood, and I can make out some details in the flowers here and the petals. So it's not like very muddy. At the same time, it's also not as detailed often as Japanese fittings are. And for $400, it's not bad if you like them stylistically. There's nothing sharp or terribly bad about them. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like they've colored outside the lines either. That's usually my main complaint. But when I see this, I think gaudy and just not to my taste. So I'll say that there. But apart from that, these are reasonably well executed. I don't see that the detailing is finger painted on. And by that I mean very often the gold and silver isn't on the branch. They just kind of, they're loosely in the area that they're supposed to be, and they color over the line sometimes. I don't see that here. There's also some kind of stippling or you know, texture on the kashira here, and it's nice. It doesn't bite my fingers. It has a handsome look. The patina on it is okay. And anyway, I can see that some people will likely like the look of this. They're not as crude as some of the other ones that I've seen out there. Moving up from there, the knots are not badly placed. They're not as recessed. The end knot here stands out a little bit. Not something that I harp on most of the time in reviews. Not something I harp on particularly for a $400 sword, but worth noting that they are tight and don't move around. Also, the ito here, very tight. If I move up to the handle here, when I say very tight, the goal here is to have a sword where I can just put all my body weight, on my finger, stand on one of those knots, and they won't move. And unfortunately, that's not what's happening here. But that's a very high bar and not really achievable in most swords. There are very, very few sword companies that put Ito out that's that tight. Evolution Blades, Moto-haba seems to be about the only one that I've really come across that consistently does it. Maybe Citadel, and you're talking about swords that are going to be a couple $1,000s or more. In this case, though, the knots don't displace even a millimeter with a good amount of pressure, so I would give this overall in the $400 sword range actually pretty high marks. It doesn't, well, one, it hasn't come loose. It hasn't loosened at all over the course of the better part of a year or more having this, and I've used it. It doesn't show a lot of signs of age. None of the knots or diamonds are kajiggery or moving around. All of the telltale signs of bad. It's aged particularly well, and has held up to the usage that I put in it. And it gives me confidence, honestly, that if I were to use one of these for a long time, several years, that the material would likely hold up well. I don't know if it's going to hold up as well as silk does because it is a leather style material, but for leather, I think it's going to hold up well. And this, again, for a $400 sword is really quite tight. Honestly, if you get a $400 sword, a lot of times you get a handle that feels like it's going to come apart. That can happen even on $3,000 swords. So sometimes you get a handle where you move it around and the Ito feels all squirrely, and that just means it's going to come apart on you when you are training with it. I don't sense any of that here, and I've taken a very long time to basically say that it seems trustworthy. So from there, the diamonds don't wander a whole lot. They seem overall pretty well put on there. I can make out what appear to be Hishigami or maybe the panel lines. So there's at least some aesthetic something here that I'm seeing, which I believe is probably the panel line. But overall, not bad and very functional and very secure. Shape-wise of the handle, it's not a dainty little thing. It's also not an axe handle. It's in between. I would describe it as comfortable. Their skin for the Samegawa panels on here are not bad. They're not like super small, ratty looking skins. At the same time, they're not, I don't see an emperor node or particularly large skins, which, again, all things that I would say are perfectly acceptable in a sword around the $400 price point. The Manuki on here are floral, and they also don't pull my eye in. So the fittings at least are balanced in such a way where my eye doesn't inherently go to one thing. I've talked about my thoughts on the aesthetics of gold and silver detailing, but I would say that at least it's applied here in a way that doesn't make my eye weighted to one particular part on the sword over the other. So at least that much I can say I like. See, I'm being complimentary here. There's one Makugi peg that is placed here. There could be another one hiding somewhere, but I don't see it. I believe there is just one peg. Moving up to the Fuchi, the transitions here are well done. The detailing on the Fuchi is a branch, and it's maybe the simplest of the designs in terms of the floral branch theme that seems to be on here. The one on the kashira, I believe, is a little bit better done. The Tsuba has what looks like a raised rim. It's not, I'm guessing it's cast or carved out this way. I believe it's cast. Anyway, has a slight raised rim, and it has the silver and gold detailing on it. The grooves and whatnot in here are a little bit broader, so it appears marginally more detailed, and at least the theme is consistent. There are branches and cherry blossoms, I believe. The saya is an Ishime saya and doesn't rattle. Not really much going on here, but it has this Ishime texture to it. Not really any parts special to speak of. There's no horn, kojiri, kurigata, or koiguchi area up here. It all appears to be simple wood. That is a little bit of a downside because there are swords that certainly in the $400 price point will offer some horn parts on the scabbard for you. Is that a requirement? No. Is it better? I don't necessarily think it's a requirement. The concern is that this koiguchi area here, if it doesn't have some extra reinforcement, which the horn provides to some very small degree, it's just easier to cut through and into your hand if you're using a sharp sword. So I always personally like it when scabbards have horn on them. I also like it even more if they're wrapped in rattan or have some semigawa or something on here. If you're practicing with it and you're doing anything maybe faster than you should or make a mistake, it's very easy to cut through this part of the scabbard and into the meat of your hand, which is not a fun day for anyone. So Having just simple wood is okay, but I prefer a little extra structure there. Again, in the $400 price point, though, concessions have to be made. The scabbard doesn't rattle. The tension on it is pretty good. Incidentally, tension on it has held up pretty well over the last few, the time that I've had it, which I want to say is the better part of a year, and it's drawing and sheathing just fine. And I've practiced using it for EI in that period several times in the winter outside, in the summer now where it's a little bit more humid, and yeah, it's held up well. It's held up, and I haven't noticed anything tension-wise that has bound or gotten to a point where it's not something I can tolerate, or something that's really notable in my mind is like, oh, this time it was sticky or something like that. It's held up as a good training tool throughout all the seasons. The Shidodome that came on here were not glued in. I think I've managed to keep it secure enough where they haven't bounced around and scratched the scabbard, but it's a personal preference that they're glued in. I understand that some people just like to take them out. Some people like to change them, and if you glue them in, then that is much harder to do. So depending on your preference, to me, if there's a scabbard and it's got them on there, I like to have them glued in, because then as soon as I untie it to train with it, it's either a step where I have to glue them in, and I don't really want to, or I have to just pull them off, which I haven't done here because I didn't want to lose them, and I'm sending it back to Sword Friend John. Moving on to the Habaki, it is a simple brass Habaki, and there's frankly not much to say here, other than RVA Katana or Cloudhammer Steelworks has the ability to do some textured cool stuff with Habaki that I haven't seen from other manufacturers. This is a simple brass Habaki, and it's fine in a $400 sword, but I always see it as an opportunity to show an extra little bit of zazz. Unfortunately, it's not on this sword here. Anyway, simple brass Habaki. It did the job of tensioning the sword well, and it does what it's supposed to do otherwise. All right, now I'll talk about the blade, the pointy stabby part, and this is tricky for me because it's what most of you are interested in, and honestly, there's the least amount to say. This has a shape very similar to what you've seen with other Cloudhammer swords. No bohea, no folded steel, and I'm not docking it for the lack of features here. There's just not much to talk about in terms of the surface of the steel. It's got more of a mirror polish than a satin polish. The scratches from my cutting sessions show through on the blade. It does have a Yokote on it, which is, I would say, more chiseled or ground in than polished in, because I can feel it more than I can see it. It also has maybe a high shinogi as a note. The shinogi does ride a little bit on the high side, which is not bad. It gives it a nice big bevel, which is probably going to help you in cutting and reduces a little bit on the weight. And no reinforced kasaki up here. It doesn't swell out as some Japanese swords do, and it's quiet a little bit in the swing because of all of these features. But more or less, it's made to be a performance dojo-style cutter. So the through-hardened, kind of polished blade is what you get. And Cloudhammer does offer a bunch of folded steels if you're looking for something with a little more panache in the surface of the steel, a little bit more character. But this is made to be forgiving and resilient and cost-effective, and I think they've achieved that. But there's just not much in the way of detailing to share with you, because it has a pretty bog-standard shape and general look without a whole lot other than a mirror polish. Anyway, for $400 and needing to be durable, it doesn't also have to be pretty. I suppose the note I can add to it is that the polish does show a pretty fair amount of signs of scratches. So this isn't unexpected. If you cut a pool noodle with a mirror polished object, sometimes it will show scratches. But I've cut cardboard and things that typically leave scratches. I would just say that they're very abundant in the surface of the steel, that I can make out the scratches pretty easy. Not a problem, but something worth noting that they're there. Now I can talk a little bit about the experience of moving it around, and more or less my favorite feature is the handle. I really like the Ito here. It's very comfortable. Wet hand, dry hand, cold or warm. It always feels a little bit like a lazy boy, and it's soft, but that doesn't mean that it's loose. I don't have a problem gripping it, and it makes me feel very secure in the hand, and I don't feel like I'm white knuckling it or holding it so hard that I'm fatiguing myself in the process of swinging the sword around. The sword itself is not particularly heavy. It's 2 pounds, 4 ounces, somewhere in there. Measurements, again, are in the description down below. But you feel it. It's not particularly light or lively feeling in the hand. It feels like it would have authority in the cut. I don't feel like I lack control, but at the same time, it's a little bit more stout feeling in the hand than some other lighter swords are, particularly for a sword that's under 2 pounds, 8 ounces. This is on the lighter, the medium light side of swords. And it has a feeling of a more medium katana. It feels heavier than I would say it actually is. At the same time, it's not bad. It's not bad. I don't have a problem moving it around. I don't have a problem blocking. I don't have a problem generating tip speed or stopping it. But it does feel maybe a little bit harder to initiate that momentum on. That said, My main complaint really isn't the weight, and honestly, I don't really have a complaint to weight. A lot of people tend to like something that has a little bit more substance in the chop. That's not a bad feeling at all. It's just an observation that it's there. Another point that I would have, which isn't necessarily a complaint, it's due to the way the sword's designed, is that it's quiet. So while I like moving it around, and I don't necessarily get tired doing so, I can't hear it. I can't hear it real well. There's no bohi, there's no reinforced kasaki up there, so it's going to be a little bit quieter. It probably does make noise, but not so much that I can hear if I'm doing the technique well. And that's, as a training tool, where I find it to be a little bit of a deterrent, or didn't find I wanted to practice with it as much because I couldn't tell if I was doing stuff well or not. Anyway, generally speaking, it checks most of the boxes that you would want as a practitioner. The tension is reasonably well. It draws reasonably quietly. It doesn't rattle a whole lot. The ito's pretty tight. It's just tough to hear if you're doing the technique correctly or not. Moving on to the subject of cutting with it. So I've cut in a few different seasons and a few different targets, water bottles and the like. The sword is sharp, but I wouldn't call it super sharp. So it would certainly cut through water bottles and pool noodles, but it didn't pop anything apart super well. There were a couple good cuts that I got in there, but I really had to throw it out there to get through some of the targets that a sharper sword might have been able to get through. I don't know if this sword did, but sometimes Cloudhammer Steelworks swords come with a little honing ceramic stone or something, and I bet if I took that to it, it might have worked a little better. It's certainly quite sharp, but I think it could be just a little bit sharper, and that would have aided in popping the pool noodles apart and maybe getting some more effective cuts on the water bottles. But that said, I did some other more aggressive things with it. So I'm trying to return this in one solid piece to John, but I did push a little bit. So I took it to some cardboard tubes, which are no joke to cut. They take quite a bit of chutzpah to get through, and it does get through them. But there were several bad cuts that went into those cardboard tubes, from not just me, but a few other folks. So since this is a dojo beater, I had some folks over that also swung it like a bat into those cardboard tubes, and more or less it held up. It didn't bend. I slapped it on the stand a few times to see if it would kind of go out of shape. It had plenty of bad cuts go through it, but the sword is still straight, still good, and there wasn't any edge rolling or anything like that. It's held up and seemingly just as sharp as it was when I got it, which admittedly could be a little bit sharper, but it's held up pretty well. So I do think that's a redeeming feature, that at least this one has held up pretty well. Now, I didn't take this one to the Tree of Woe. I gave it a couple little slaps, and I hit it into some harder targets, and it held up. But more than that, not only did it hold up as it's straight, but all the fittings on here are still tight. The kashira is still on there. The ito isn't loose. The only thing that I could really do is probably give it a clean before I send it back to Sword Friend John. So it held up reasonably well to what I did. All right, sword friends, I suppose I can answer the question, do I personally think it's worth it or not? And at $400, I would say no for me, and that's mostly the aesthetics. I don't like the theme of the fittings, but if you slapped a swirly Mitsudome on there, then I would probably say yes. I really like the handle on here, apart from the fittings that are on it. It held together well, and that's not something to overlook in the $400 price category. I've had a lot of $400 swords that have ito that gives me the impression it's going to come loose within a few months of training. This doesn't have that impression, and it's expensive to fix. I think the blade could be a little thicker, or not thicker, but sharper, and I'm not sure about how durable it is, but if I think about my experience with Cloudhammer Steelworks and testing the ones that I have to failure, they've ranged from perfectly acceptable to wildly impressive, like the S7 sword that was sent to me many moons ago. So I'm going to assume that it's probably going to hold up to doing some sword-related things quite well, and it held up to what I tested. So could be a little bit sharper, could have a cooler theme, but otherwise I think it checks more boxes than it misses, and so I would say it's worthy of consideration for the $400 price point, especially since buying them from RVA Katana is an easy experience and most people seem reasonably happy with it. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Hopefully it's been a useful video. I do want to offer again a special thanks to Sword Friend John for not only sending me these samples, but having the patience to wait for me to finish with them, because I know I have taken my sweet time. Anyway, thanks again to John at RVA Katana, and cheers, and thanks for watching.